All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's me again. So today's reflective practice session, we're going to dive straight in. We're going to be doing some talking about perception and space and memory and senses. It's going to be kind of this kind of interesting mixture of topics, but we will have fun talking about it. Essentially, this session, as always, is supposed to feed into some of your other stuff that you're going to be doing during the course of the week. So you will find out more about this in studio, if not already. This is really just to give you some food for thought for your kind of upcoming tasks that you'll be given over the course of to complete over the course of Christmas to get you ready for next term. So I won't get too much into detail about that, but I think let's just kind of also acknowledge that this is our last session before, well, this is the last session of 2020 and last session before you break up for Christmas. So I'd also like to hear how you thought the last few sessions have gone. Some of the topics, some of the things. I'd really like to get this conversation started so I can understand what works for you and what doesn't work so well, so that we can kind of keep this momentum going. But like I said, today we're going to be talking a little bit more about perception and space. We're going to be really looking at the three main senses. I'm not saying these are the only senses. There's obviously a lot more senses than this. There's the eyes. The ones that we're going to be looking today are seeing, hearing, and smelling. No tasting. All of that will be investigated, and we will be thinking a bit about how to kind of subvert and play with that in this session. So we'll be asking some questions, framing around that. But yeah, let's dive straight in. I don't dally for too long. So when you are asked about kind of like memory, when you think about a memory or when you're remembering a place, you know, most people would really start by describing the visual side of it, right? Because that's kind of, you know, as a society, we're very visually dominated. We like to see things and we kind of like to describe them as we see them. But there's actually a lot more to it than this. And again, like I said, literally a minute ago, we're going to focus on through the three main senses, but these are not the only senses. And there's actually like a taxonomy of like 7 to 8 senses, depending on who you ask. But anyway, that's besides the point. But I think let's just break it down into these three and have a little kind of experimentation with what that looks like. So first, we're going to look at seeing, if it will. Yeah. So the eyes kind of really mediate the world around us in a lot of ways. And obviously the most directly obvious way is how we perceive space. Here is a diagram it's a lovely handy diagram that shows you how different tones, contrasting tones, can help change how you perceive a space. So, you know, as you can see, if you want a space to feel longer, you'd put a darker wall at the back and then lighter walls along the side. If you want to raise the roof, you will kind of paint the walls a darker tone and the roof a lighter tone, ceiling, sorry, a lighter tone, and vice versa. So this is an interesting way of thinking about how you can kind of almost play around with that perception. And this is actually jumping ahead a little bit and thinking about what that means for our own kind of project. But there's also, on the other scale, when you think about the city, the way we perceive things is also about eye level too. So it's about where your eyes are situated relative to the rest of your body, but also to your environment. And this is actually something that you see quite often when people talk about high streets, which we'll be talking quite a lot about today, and public realm, is the idea of the city at eye level, you know, making sure that all the interfaces that are kind of most engaging, most interesting happen at eye level. And I mean, the reason for that really is just kind of when humans were roaming around the savannah, you know, it was a vast open plain. So humans never really needed to look up because there was no real predators kind of coming from above. You know, you look at predators and prey on a horizontal plane. Anyway, so that's kind of one of the reasons why the idea of like looking horizontally is really interesting. It's carried through this kind of evolutionary trait into this everyday practice of design. But let's think a little bit more in grounded terms. Let's think a little bit more in the everyday. So this kind of emphasis on the street level, eye level situation kind of means that we don't necessarily have a lot of observation about things that are above that certain angle. I think the angle is 15 degrees. I'm not entirely sure. But what this means is that all our experiences of space are almost kind of always shaped by this very thin line. So this is, to give you a bit of context, this is my local high street. This is Kentish Town Road. And I go up and down this road quite often. I'm either cycling along it, walking to the tube station, or just kind of looking around and going to Iceland to get ice cream or whatever, doing my shopping. And actually, up until quite recently, I'd never really looked up, you know, and I think one thing that you notice is that actually what happens when you do look up, you know, you start to notice things like I didn't, when I first saw this, I didn't realize that building specifically, this co-op, had a brick building on top. I thought it was going to be like the other buildings, which are these kind of like lighter brick buildings with these kind of interesting windows. It wasn't like a huge revelation, but it just made me realize actually how much do I actually pay attention to that's above this slot. And this is what we'd like you to think about today. So think about your own local high street. Think about what do you remember? Think about the shops that you remember. Think about the bus stop that you remember. Do you remember the order of the shops? Do you remember where the bus stop is relative to what? But if I ask you to, chances are you probably will have some idea. But if I ask you to think about looking up and remembering how many stories the buildings on the high street are, if I ask you to think about what the windows are like, are the buildings old, it's unlikely that many of you will have any idea. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's kind of my own perception, and that's how I see it. It's interesting how that perception of like that small, narrow, horizontal space affects it. And so it's about, again, remembering your high street as via a small portion, but it's also the portion where there's most interaction and most engagement. So what about your ears? Well, often when we think of memories, we think of often when we think of memories, we think about music really distinctly. But there's actually so much more to more than just music and words and phrases. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it. Okay, yeah. So when we think about when you think about memories, you might remember that music very distinctly. It's actually so much more than sound than just music and words and phrases. Really think back to this picture you described. How different does it sound when there isn't a rush of cars flying by, when there isn't like the hubbub of people talking as they walk past? How different is it? And think back to when you're walking as well. You often come across these restaurants, places where there's plates and dishes and coffees flying around. People talk. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, but think about that time, and just imagine this place that's spilling out into the pavement, this activity, this noise, this kind of life. And do you see that in your local high street? Do you see that as you walk? Really just to try to engage with the sound, let it carry you. Or maybe even as you're walking, you might be walking past the supermarket. Maybe you go into the supermarket. The idea of the sounds of these scanners, these kind of tills, just tugging along as you walk by. Really, the main point I want to make with this is the idea that our ears are actually really integral to how we perceive space and how we understand space. So one thing that's even more important about it is ears are actually incredibly good at detecting direction. So think about how these sounds are part of your observation in space as you move through it. Then think about how you move through the sounds themselves. So not just about the space. As you walk past something, you only catch glimpses of it, versus if you're in that environment. How does that make a difference? What would happen? If you wanted to play around with that, what would happen if you experienced your space most of us walk around with headphones, and I know I do. So my perception of the space is now drastically different. Of course, there's also the sense of smell. I mean, depending on your high street, you might have some fairly unsavory smells around. But on the other hand, you also might have a bakery. So this is, again, on my local high street, there's a bakery called Gale's. I think it's a chain. I'm pretty sure it's a chain. It has a really nice smell to it. I love walking past this place. I love the smell of fresh bread. It's just nice. Or, this was agony for me. As a university student, when I was at Manchester, walking past this Greg's every morning, it's the smell of the kind of the pastry, the smell of the coffee that wafts out. It was, it was great. And it really, again, it's like it forms part of my routine and part of my memory of the place because of the fact that it had that distinct, strong smell. And so, think a little bit more about that as well, as that how do you define how you experience the space based on that kind of very few quick interaction. And so some of you might be asking, what does this all mean? What's really the point? Well, I think the point is just to try and think a little bit more about the experience side of things. A lot of you have been talking to your clients, a lot of you have been interviewing your clients, some of you have been kind of like formulating ideas around that. But actually, it's also really important for you to consider how that looks and how that sounds and how that feels, like really get into that side of things. And it's really important because the senses that you have and really affect how you perceive, but also how you read back space. How you remember it essentially. Um, Let me elaborate with a very brief personal example. So last year, in 2018, I moved to the Netherlands. I lived in a city called Rotterdam in the Netherlands, in south of the Netherlands. And I lived in the south side of the city. And actually, I lived quite close to this dot here. I lived around here. And this was an interesting part of the city. I lived quite close to a market. It's called Market, it's Afrikaanderplein Market. And this market was just so good. This market to me I have strong memories of this market based on my experiences and my senses. You had fresh fruit, vegetables, really colorful, really bright, just like an absolutely buzzing place. And this market would happen twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays from 8 till 4:30 a.m. 4:30 p.m. Sorry, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And actually, this became part of my routine to go and visit this place that was kind of so bright and vivid and colorful. And one of my senses was kind of like, in some way or form, really deeply engaged with this place. And so my memory and my routine were brought together by this idea of the senses. And the reason why I say that is because I used to go there every morning on Saturday, and I used to go there around 9:30. And that was because the space was a specific type of volume, because there wasn't too many people, so it wasn't too crowded, too loud, too busy, but it was also nice, lots of fresh fruit and veg. And so that kind of really played into my own routine. Is like, I actually really like this level of sensory, let's say, management. It was manageable rather than overloading, which is what would happen if I went like at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, when you had a lot more people and lots of more things going on. So in terms of visual side, this is what I thought was really interesting: the colors, the brightness, the vibrancy of it, and the busyness of it. But in terms of smells as well, they had fresh fish, they had fresh crabs. Some of them literally were just kind of like jumping out of these boxes and trying to run away. Some amazing things to see. And, again, really fresh, really beautiful. And there was also a bakery somewhere there as well, so there's fresh bread as well. So lots of different smells. And actually, one things I didn't get a picture of is there was this actually beautiful Turkish bakery next to the place that I used to go to straight after whenever I had my food. Whenever I did my shopping, every Saturday I'd go to that bakery straight after, and the smell was just so gorgeous. I used to love it. And again, the routine was formed out of the smell, out of response to these senses. And I mean, obviously, in terms of ears, these spaces are lively. They didn't just sell fruits and veg; they also sold toys. You had things like this, which produce these kind of really weird soundscapes, as I would call them, these kind of like different fields of experience. And then you also had market people selling things, but also trying to get people's attention. This is part of the characteristic of markets. You just hear people kind of calling or talking, or I don't know the exact term, but just really trying to get people's attention. And it builds a soundscape. And here's the bakery in all its glory. They literally bake the bread right there, right in front of you. And you just hear lots of snippets of conversation. And this part of Rotterdam was very kind of like multicultural, so you had lots of different languages going in your ear. So it was like really soundscape. So I think it's really important to kind of just, I'm going to wrap up. So basically, that's one example of what I think is a good weaving of both the idea of like routine and sounds and senses and kind of like experiences, really. And for me, it's really hard to remember this space distinctly without really thinking a lot about these experiences, about these sounds, and about these sights. And that's why I took pictures of them. That's why I documented them, because it was such a core part of that experience for me. It was subconscious, but I think now that I think back on it, it was very much part of the reason why I was enjoying it so much. And like I said, this optimal sort of like sensory experience was not the only reason I had to get food, obviously, but like one of the main reasons why I was really interested in coming back to that place. And so that takes us on to your questions for this week. Two very quick questions. Think back to your own high streets, What comes to mind first? And what sense is most important to you when you remember something? And these two questions can be kind of very closely linked together. But the idea is really like, when you think about your own high street, which is an exercise that you'll have to do later on as well, what comes to mind first? Do you remember a bus stop? Do you remember a specific shop? Do you remember a tree? Do you remember, I don't know, like a park bench? what do you remember and why do you remember it? Like, what do you have a memory associated to it? Do you have a sense of like feeling associated to it? What is it about that? And then going off that, the second question would really link in, which is about what is most important to you when you remember something. Is it the colors? Is it the sounds? Is it the song that you hear at the time? I'm very music centered, so I will mostly remember a song and then I'll remember immediately where I heard it first or a really strong connection to that memory. So think a little bit about these things and don't be afraid to go a little bit wider than just some of these first senses too. Think about how your first sense of taste, think about your sense of time. I don't know, maybe that's too abstract. But anyway, I look forward to hearing what you think about this, and I will see you all very soon.